Just about a year ago, a 6-year-old boy who was on his way to kindergarten was fatally shot in his car on an Orange County freeway. This week, the two suspects pleaded not guilty to the killing, a death which authorities believe was the direct result of road rage. Tensions are running really high right now for so many of us as this pandemic drags on. One study from the American Psychologists Association found that 84% of therapists surveyed reported an increased demand since the pandemic began. For more on this, we're joined again by Dr. Curly Bonds, Chief Medical Officer with LA County's Department of Mental Health. Dr. Bonds, thank you for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
I stumbled over that word because I'm thinking about another word, and it's a word that stood out to me a lot in the reports on this lately, and that is trauma, which I feel like is a word that people conventionally think of as what we say when someone has gone to war or lived through a wildfire. But do you feel like trauma is an appropriate word to use to describe what nearly every single one of us is going through right now? Year after year after year of living in a pandemic. And that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg.
Right. You are so correct. I would think that trauma is an appropriate word. In fact, it can come in many different forms. There's, of course, combat trauma, like you mentioned. There's also domestic violence. There's personal violence. But there's also those things that we think of as microaggressions that with some of the difficult conversations that people have had as we focus more on racial inequities in our society. There are a lot of things that I think are in the spectrum, but trauma is both psychological, physical, and sometimes emotional or mental.
And that's certainly what it felt like at the very beginning of the pandemic. I feel like now we're in a very different chapter. You know, you look at today, it was a beautiful sunny day. My kids are back in school. I'm here at work. You know, by all accounts, it's normal, and yet it is totally not normal at all. There is a war going on in Ukraine. There is climate crisis. There's a million and one other things. But it's supposed to be better now. Do you feel like that might exacerbate things, this feeling that we should be feeling better, but so much still remains unresolved?
Well, I think we all sort of think of ourselves as being resilient individuals, but our batteries are just drained. I think at this point, if we were machines, we'd need to sit down and plug in and try to charge back up. Yeah. So I think that the idea that we're out of this is just almost a false hope. And it seems like every time we recover from one thing, there's either a new surge or there's some civil or other unrest that happens in society. And then there's the chronic background of things like the economy and inflation. And I think as we begin to get back to normal, giving out some of the mixed messages around, is it safe to do things? Where do we go? What can we do in terms of protecting ourselves? Do we get a booster? I think there's just a lot of emotional and mental overload coming from so much information.
Oh, I think you're so right. I really like your machine analogies. I'm going to keep running with that, Dr. Bonds. I feel like instead of getting that chance to plug and recharge, we just got to keep going, which means the slightest little thing touches our circuits and boom, we explode. We mentioned the awful tragedy involving road rage, but I feel like we're seeing it everywhere in all sorts of manifestations. Recently, there was a fight that erupted at a Japanese restaurant, a family restaurant in La Cañada, Flint Ridge. This went viral. And look, I don't know what caused that particular incident, but does that rage factor, that lashing out, does it seem like not that big of a surprise given how much duress we're under right now?
Not at all. I would say that when someone does experience trauma or any type of violence, it activates this fight response in our bodies. And we have chronically high levels now, probably all of us, of those hormones that mediate stress, like cortisol and adrenaline, or the neurohormones. And I think those things over time can take their toll. They both wear down the body physically, they cause premature aging, they can aggravate chronic medical conditions like diabetes or hypertension. And it also can disrupt our normal circadian rhythms, the rhythms that help us be awake or asleep. A lot of people that I've met, both clinically and socially, have had sleep disturbances because they just can't seem to get back on track. And we've had so many of our normal routines that have been turned upside down, both by the pandemic and then also by some of the changes that we've had to do in the wake of it. Getting access to steady food, clothing, shelter for some people. As we've heard in this earlier reports tonight, it's been a real challenge.
Yeah. So, Dr. Bonds, what do we do? I mean, really, what do we do? What are some very practical tips, no matter how not large or small, that just about everyone here in Southern California can do when we're feeling, okay, those sparks are flying, I'm ready to lash out, but we don't, hopefully none of us want to do that.
I'm so glad that you asked. There are a lot of things that we can do. And of course, one of the top of the list is to talk to somebody about this. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a trained professional. There are a few tools that are available through the Department of Mental Health. One of them is I Prevail, which is an online peer support application that uses a cognitive behavioral therapy style to help people work through both personal problems and life challenges. Meditation is another really important and useful thing. And I see now the screen is showing movement, getting some exercise, taking a break, even if it's just standing up at your desk between those meetings and getting a bit of stretching in. Cardiovascular exercise that gets the heart rate up and gets the lungs filling with fresh air is really, really good to help mediate some of that stress response. It's almost like we're trying to come up with countermeasures that help us normalize and sort of push a reset button internally.
Yeah, and the list that we showed prior to those great exercises, the list that we showed came from the, I feel like, version 1.0 of your department's list of at the very beginning. It was like, oh my gosh, what could we do? And it was in that day of like, oh, let's we're going to remotely watch a TV show together or do something because we couldn't connect. Can you talk a little bit about now? Because I feel like we're in this weird in-between space, right? Cases are down, but they're kind of starting to tick up again. And just, I feel like we relied so much on the virtual that now we're almost overusing it, and even getting back to kind of more unplugged things might be good for our mental headspace. Are there any kind of like acoustic, unplugged, I guess, is the word that I'm looking for, things that you would particularly recommend now that it's a little safer?
I would say that it's still important to be cautious. And for every individual, there's going to be their own formula, their own experience, and their own medical condition. I think for some members of our community, it's really not as safe. I would hope that at this point, everyone has taken advantage of vaccines, and at this point, older adults were able to get boosted, and so you can do everything that you can to protect yourself. And even though you're not required to wear a mask, you still can. But I think you also have to factor in that isolation and loneliness go hand in hand. Being apart from other people takes you away from those protective social matrices that we all exist in. I would say if you're a person of faith, being able to go out and commune with others at this point, those are things that you might want to do, but you might not be ready to go to a big concert yet. I would say that you have to sort of selectively decide what are you ready to do and to ease back into it. Don't go out like if we were training for a marathon, we wouldn't go run 26 miles at first, we just start with a couple. So I think we have to kind of slowly boost up our ability to engage with other people and being cautious based on what our own personal background and our value systems are.
Dr. Curly Bonds, I always just even feel better talking to you. I hope that you and your colleagues are taking some self-care moments for yourself as well. And thank you so much for sharing these resources with us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks. It's so important. Appreciate being here.
And viewers, I want to leave by sharing one more great way to unwind. Why not relax with a good movie, like a rom-com, like When Harry Met Sally, which of course included that classic line, I'll have what she's having. That also happens to be the name of a new exhibition at the Skirball, all about